Hi everyone, my name is Graham Slack. I'm the Scholarly Communications and Copyright Outreach Librarian here at Robarts Library. And first of all, I wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. Now I'd like to welcome Julie Hannaford, who's the Deputy Chief Librarian of University of Toronto Libraries, who's going to say a few words of welcome. Thank you.
Hi everybody. Welcome to the Open Textbooks, Open Minds, a colloquium exploring reuse of open resources to improve quality and access. And I'd like to start by thanking eCampus Ontario for supporting this event via an Open Education Week Planning Kit grant. By nature of the grant, it's allowed us to do the web streaming of today's event and will also allow us to do a transcribed, professionally edited version of today's recording, and that'll be available in a few days or down the road. The link will go out when it's ready, right? So why are we all gathered here today? This afternoon we have together open education practitioners from the 3 U of T campuses and beyond. It's a wonderful opportunity to discuss experiences in advocating for, managing, or working to create or adapt open education resources and projects. There'll be an opportunity to hear from a number of open education practitioners, librarians, instructors, students, educational technologists, and project managers from the University of Toronto as well as from other institutions in Ontario. And this is also an excellent time to take stock and reflect on what has been accomplished so far. eCampus Ontario supported many of the projects we'll hear about today. In 2018, eCampus grants covered 7 projects through the University of Toronto. These eCampus grants supported a range of projects such as open modules, new open textbooks, or adaptations. The funding is very impactful. Presenters who have received funding will talk about what was involved in the work to begin and end these projects and how to sustain and keep the momentum going once the grant is successfully concluded. And as I think we all know, there's an amazing potential for open education now in terms of reducing student costs and increasing student success. But building support for open education requires research and advocacy, so the open education research agenda continues. Today's sessions will really explore the really positive impacts that are possible on students. So I think we're in for a terrific afternoon. Thank you all for coming, and I hope you have a terrific afternoon.
Thank you, Julie. She's gone already, but thank you. So now I'd like to introduce our first speaker of the afternoon, who's Heather Martin. Heather is the Copyright Officer and Manager of the eLearning and Reserve Services at the University of Guelph. She's a member of the University of Guelph's Open and Affordable Course Content Task Force, and she's here to share some of the amazing work this task force has done, along with its partners at the University of Guelph. So thank you very much, Heather, for being here. Set up your slides. Are they?
Should be,
this one?
I put them on the desktop. So
they're on the desktop.
Yeah, I think they're the PowerPoint.
Okay.
There.
There we go.
Yeah.
And what did I just do? There we go.
Yay.
Does that look right?
So far. I have one slide with really odd formatting. I'm keeping my fingers crossed. It looks okay. So thank you for having me here today. I'm really excited to be sharing the work that we've done at the University of Guelph around student textbook surveys and amplifying the voices of our students in order to start open education conversations at the university. OER advocacy at the University of Guelph really began back, well, it began before fall 2016, but it really got kicked off with a partnership in the fall of 2016 between our Central Student Association and the library. We were approached by the VP Academic from our Central Student Association who was concerned. She had campaigned on textbook affordability. She was concerned that we didn't have more copies of textbooks, of required textbooks on reserve in the library. And out of this conversation, we decided that we needed to find out more about whether textbook affordability was an issue at the university. And if so, how big of an issue was it? And so we also thought it would be the opportunity for us to use some of the data that we collected in a survey to raise awareness of open educational resources among both students and faculty. So it was called the Textbook Broke Survey because it actually coincided with textbook broke campaigns that were happening elsewhere in Canada and in the United States as well. And we had a few key questions that we really wanted to find out from the survey. Are students actually buying textbooks? We'd been hearing anecdotal evidence that in fact they weren't. If not, why were they not buying textbooks? Was it just because of the affordability issue, or were there others? If not, how were they managing without them? What are they doing instead? And what, in their opinion, are the negative impacts, if there were any, of not having the required textbook for a course? And I think out of all of this, we really wanted to know whether there was anything that we could do about it. And as a result of running the survey and needing a group to gather the data and analyze the results, we actually put together at that time an open and affordable course content task force on our campus. And this was really our first project, was dealing with the data from the survey. So we actually put the survey together really quickly. It was already the beginning of the fall semester. We really wanted to survey students while their textbook purchases were still fresh in their minds. So we just put together a 4-question survey. It was 4 multiple choice questions plus a free text field for them to add their comments. It was sent out by the Central Student Association as opposed to coming from the library or anywhere else, and we felt that this was really important to getting buy-in from the students because it would come from someone who was also a student and someone who had a group that had their interests in mind. None of the questions were mandatory. It was an anonymous survey. We ran it for 6 weeks. We didn't have much of an incentive. We had, I think, like a couple of $10 gift cards or something like that. But we had an overwhelming response rate. We were actually blown away. I remember looking at the results the first week into the survey, and I could not believe how many students at that point had already responded. So by the end of it, we had 4,240 responses, which is basically 21% of our undergraduate population. So we felt we were really happy with that. And we also got 3,200 free text comments as well. We weren't sure whether students would add their comments because the questions weren't mandatory. We thought it might be just as quick for them to go through and do the multiple choice, but we got a lot of valuable comments from the survey as well. So the questions that we actually asked on the Fall 16 survey, and they were a bit problematic because we pulled it together fairly quickly. I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. How much did students spend on their textbooks this semester for all of their classes? Have they ever not purchased or opted not to purchase a textbook? If they didn't purchase a textbook, what did they do instead? How concerned were they about not having the required textbook? And then we had the free text field where they could tell us what they felt the downsides were to not having a required textbook. Before I go on to talk about the results of the survey, I also want to talk about the fact that we repeated the survey in the winter of 2018. By this time, our task force was fully established, and from having analyzed all the data from the first survey, we actually knew what we wanted to do differently the second time around. We knew what the gaps were in the information we had collected. So this time we had 9 multiple choice questions. Plus some additional free text fields for comments. We had modified some of the previous questions, plus added some new ones. And because the first time around we didn't collect any information, any kind of demographic information at all, this time we collected information on what college the students were in and what program, and also their year of study. Again, the questions weren't mandatory, it was anonymous, and we did get fewer responses than we did in the 2016 survey, but it did affirm some of our previous results, which we were happy about. So as you can see, almost half the number of responses for the winter 2018 survey and half the number of comments as well. In terms of why, we have some theories. We thought that there was a pretty good chance that some students had already completed the previous survey. It was actually a longer survey, 9 questions instead of 4. That may have been a deterrent to some people. There was a longer preamble to the survey that they had to kind of read or scroll through before they completed it. It was also the winter semester rather than the fall semester. We kind of wanted to survey during both, but I have a feeling the winter semester starts off busier faster, and that may have been a bit of a deterrent to students as well. And it may have been elements of all of the above. So the winter questions are a little, we tweaked them a little bit. One of the things we weren't sure about with the results from the fall survey was when students told us how much they'd spent on textbooks, whether that was all of their textbooks or not that they were talking about, or did they only buy 1 or 2 textbooks? Because we were a little bit surprised that the amount seemed much lower than we had been led to believe from doing some research about other such surveys that it would be. So this time we made the question more specific and asked them, did you purchase all of your required textbooks for all of your courses this semester? And if you didn't, how many did you choose not to purchase? And that then gave us some context for how much when they told us how much they spent on textbooks. We also asked them to tell us specifically the reasons why they didn't purchase the textbooks. And we added one question to the end as well, in addition to the sort of demographic information that we collected from them. We asked them if they'd ever made an academic decision based on the cost of a textbook, such as not enrolling in a course, dropping a course, dropping out for the semester. And so we gathered some student feedback on those kinds of things as well. So this is what we learned. It was actually, we couldn't compare all parts of the fall and the winter survey results because some of them did not align. I would say, I've already talked a little bit about how we phrased the questions a little bit differently, but one of the other things that we also did is in the winter survey, we allowed students to select more than one answer of the multiple choice because we found the first time around that some students were indicating to us in the comments that actually it was a combination of all of the above or whatever. So it's kind of unfair in some respects to compare some of these directly. However, the one thing that we were really interested about is the second stat there, which the number was virtually the same. The same percentage of students indicated that they did not purchase all required textbooks, and that was almost 60% in fall 2016 and a similar amount in winter 2018. So we feel like we have a pretty good handle on the number of students who are opting not to purchase all their textbooks now. In fall of 2016, 67% of students indicated that they spent more than $250 on textbooks, and that was down to 54% in the winter 2018 semester. 28% in fall 2016 indicated that they used a library's copy as an alternative to the textbook. And that was up to 37% in winter 2018. And when I explained to you some of the changes that we made as a result of these survey results, we are hoping that some of the changes we made in the library actually contributed to that increase in use of library copies of required textbooks. The other really interesting thing was that the level of concern, so the number of students who said they were either somewhat or very concerned about not purchasing the textbook, seemed to have dropped considerably from fall 2016 to winter 2018 as well. And it's, you know, I don't know whether that is a trend or whether it's also reflective of the fact that we're surveying students in the fall and in the winter semester. And maybe by the winter semester, they're more comfortable operating without all of their required text. But we thought that was an interesting change between the two survey periods. So the additional data that we collected from the second survey, which was, as I had mentioned earlier, had additional questions in it, including questions about demographic information. We found that the respondents to the survey were fairly evenly distributed by year of study. So about a quarter of them were first year, a quarter of them were in second year, and so on. We found that our veterinary students were the ones who spent the least on textbooks by quite a bit. And our business and marketing students were the group that spent the most on textbooks. Science students far more often reported not buying textbooks than students in humanities, social sciences. And we found, perhaps not surprisingly, that first-year students spent more on textbooks than any of the other years. And it was, in fact, the only year, the only cohort in which more students did purchase all of their textbooks than didn't. And third-year students actually were the least likely to have purchased all of their textbooks. So this was really interesting as well. We actually had 51% of the respondents who indicated that they had made an academic decision or a decision about a course due to the cost of the textbook in that course. So that's 22% dropped a course, 17% looked at the textbook and decided not to register, 2% actually said they had changed their program, and 1% withdrew for the semester. And this doesn't add up to 51% because there were a few other random, there was an other category as well. We found that arts and social science students tended to drop their courses more often than science students as due to the cost of the textbook. And 83%, and this was actually also consistent across both of the surveys, 83% of students reported at least one negative impact of not purchasing textbooks. We actually summarized the 3,200 comments from the first survey and came up with categories that most of them fell into. They tended to be, you know, either sort of an academic impact, a health and well-being impact. There was sort of a social impact where they talked about the impact on relationships with their peers or feeling like they were disadvantaged compared to their peers. So these were the sort of most common categories that the comment students gave us fell into. And in their own words, I really had to kind of hold back. And it's so easy to get caught up when you start reading the comments and say, oh, this is really good. You know, we had, at one point we had, I think, 10 slides full of comments that students had made in the surveys that were really telling. But I picked these ones on these slides just because I think they sort of sum up some of the different perspectives that we got. So we thought affordability was probably one of the primary reasons, and it seemed to come through. Students saying they didn't have enough money to buy all the textbooks, so they had to pick and choose which ones they wanted. They had to make a decision about which they thought would be the one they couldn't do without. We also had a lot of comments of students feeling that the value of textbooks just weren't worth the money. The cost for them was astronomical. The editions were continually being updated. They were being bundled with other things that they didn't need. And so a lot of students opted not to purchase based on dissatisfaction and unhappiness and frustration around those kinds of issues, of feeling that they were being ripped off. There are other students that obviously had extenuating circumstances. They had medical conditions, or we heard from students who were commuters. They had other things they needed to spend their money on, and they didn't feel they could afford textbooks as well. And there were also just a bunch of students who said, you know what, sometimes my instructor only uses 1 or 2 chapters out of it. It's not worth it. It's a waste. And sometimes I don't need them at all. I can manage perfectly well without them. I find other materials that provide me with the same information. On the negative impact of not having textbooks, these actually were sometimes really heartbreaking. I remember one example, which was a comment by a single mom who was driving over to Waterloo from Guelph to get a copy of a textbook that was in their library because we didn't have one and she couldn't afford to buy it. That just, we're all going, oh, that's bad. But we also got feedback about a lot of other things that and that was one of the things that we felt that maybe we could do something about. We also heard from students who complained about, yeah, there might be a copy in the library, but there's only one, and before an exam, I can't get my hands on it, and then I only have it for 2 hours, and I am in a rush. It's not my own copy. I can't annotate it. It's not there when I'm back in my dorm room and I need it to look something up. We heard a lot about stress and anxiety, wondering whether or not they had made the right decision, but having to choose between the textbook or rent or something else. A lot of students commented they felt lost in the course material, and I think particularly in courses where they indicated that their instructor basically built the course around the textbook. The textbook was the framework for the course. Losing marks on exams, a lot of concern about lower marks, but also a lot of concern about inability to learn and absorb the material without having that sort of reference there when you needed it. We also heard a lot from students who mentioned not being able to complete assignments because in order to get access to the online quizzes, they had to purchase a textbook and get the access code. And many students, way more than we expected, indicated that they were actually willing to get an automatic 0 on their quizzes and lose 10% in the course rather than pay for the textbook. That was something that they were willing to do for whatever reason. So what did we do about it? One of the first things we did is we wrote this ginormous student textbook survey report. If you're interested in reading it, there's lots and lots of data in there, lots and lots of comments. It is about 70 pages long, I think, but there is an executive summary, and it's available through the University of Guelph Library website. So worth a read for the comments alone, I believe. So we wrote that and hoped to use it as leverage to do a number of things on campus, to raise awareness of these kinds of issues for sure. But we also took to heart a lot of the comments we got about the library course reserve collections. And up until this point, we'd only ever had textbooks on reserve if a faculty member asked us to place a copy there. We decided that we could really benefit a lot of students by purchasing copies, preemptively placing copies of required textbooks on reserve for most undergraduate courses wherever it was feasible. So that, when we weren't out to sort of provide copies for every student in the class that couldn't buy one, but at least if someone needed to refer to one, there would be a copy there. They could take it out, perhaps make a copy of what they needed or get the information that they were looking for. So we actually entered into a partnership with our university bookstore in which they send us, well before the start of the semester, the list of all of the textbooks, all of the required textbooks for the upcoming term. And we actually purchased them all. We actually check first to make sure we don't already have them in the collection. And then we purchase them directly from the bookstore. They pull them, ship them to us, invoice us. And we have been doing that now since the fall of 2017. And we're still analyzing some of the data, but I know the second semester that we did it, when it was really in full swing, we had more than 30,000 circulations of textbooks from our course reserve desk, which was pretty significant. We are also implementing reserve policy changes. We heard a lot about students saying the loan periods weren't long enough, that if they needed to take a physical copy of a book out for an open book exam, if they didn't have their own copy, they couldn't do that. If sometimes they needed an overnight loan because they needed to pull an all-nighter and stay up, and the library wasn't open. And so we actually are implementing all of these changes into our reserve collection at the end of this term. And we're shifting to a self-serve reserves model as well, which we hope will improve the visibility of our textbook collection and allow students to find them more easily and enable easier access for students when they do need a copy of the textbook. This isn't solving the problem, but we felt that these were small things that we could do to sort of assist students who were really struggling. The other thing we did with the results from the survey is we used them to start conversations about open educational resources, open access, and about how open resources can increase student access and success. I think it's fair to say that most instructors on our campus had no idea that, in any given class, potentially, 50 or 60% of the students weren't purchasing the textbook. Most students seem to feel that the instructor just assumes we will have it. So I think that was an eye-opener. We deliberately reached out to the high-impact courses, so the courses with large numbers of students, or the core courses in a lot of disciplines. And what ended up happening as a result of striking up conversations, both through events such as Open Education Week events and other events that our task force organized and ran, but we also, Ali Versluis, who is Guelph's OER librarian, actually went out and struck up conversations with individual instructors who were teaching these courses. And as a result, we actually had our first major open textbook adaptation last fall in microbiology. The library and our open education, our open learning and educational support unit on campus jointly funded a course buyout for this instructor so that she could take an OpenStax open textbook and adapt it for her course. It replaced a $258 commercial textbook for 300 students in the course, which is, collectively about $77,000 worth of savings. And she updated it to include Canadian content, to improve the accessibility features of it, and to integrate more interactive content into it. And this book will actually now be used for more than just this course. It's actually being used for an additional microbiology course as well that used the previous commercial textbook. We've also been supporting some open pedagogy projects as well. The one in particular has been really exciting, and I heard all the details about it yesterday because we had an OE Week panel on our campus as well. Several of the students who were in the course, as well as the instructor, came to talk about this course. There was actually two core human physiology courses in which the instructor uses an integrated teaching approach. And there was really no suitable textbook that worked with that particular approach for these courses. So what we ended up doing is using cohorts of students who had previously taken the course, and they are enrolled in an independent study course in which they locate and evaluate learning objects for inclusion in an open textbook. And then they will end up evaluating those, researching, writing, and creating an OER. It's a 3-year project that will use 3 cohorts of students in the independent study course. And that that open educational resource, like the open textbook, will be adopted for future students of that course. So the cool thing about this project is that the students who are doing this work are able to look at this content not only from the perspective of being teachers and providing the content and thinking about how to teach a course, but they are learners as well. They were in the course. They knew what the challenges were that they had when they were doing this work, and they're going out and trying to find content that addresses those specific challenges. So this project has been a really exciting one. We've just completed the first year now. There are 2 more years to go. Again, supported by the library and Open Ed. We're really excited to see the end result when it's finished. As for next steps, we do have the winter 2018 survey report coming out soon. Hopefully it's not going to be as long as the first one was, but because of the length of time that it takes to analyze all the data, and a lot of us are just kind of doing this off the side of our desks. We have decided that we initially thought we wanted to do the survey almost annually, but I think we're probably going to do it every 3 years. We do want to keep checking in and seeing what the changes are for students, whether the situation's improving, but we're just finding it so much work to do one every year. So stay tuned, there'll be another one coming at some point in the future. We will continue to run events, and our open and affordable course content task force actually has members from our Central Students Association on it. So we work with them to run events for students to raise awareness around open educational resources, and also for faculty to continue conversations about shifting to open. We're supporting open projects such as the ones that I've just talked about, and we're also looking at collaborating with external partners as well in order to take advantage of opportunities for funding and resource sharing. Guelph is part of the Tri-University group of libraries with Waterloo and Wilfrid Laurier, and one of the things we hope to do is develop a joint approach to rolling out open and hopefully making the shift to open on all 3 campuses. That's it. Happy to take questions if anybody has any.
The mic for questions. If anyone has one, I will rush to you with the mic.
Can you talk a little bit more about how the students responded to this, the feedback from the survey? How you shared that with them and what response you got from students?
Well, you can see it kind of down the side here. We did actually an infographic. We did one for students and one for faculty, and we posted it all over the campus and made it available on our website. And we've used it in several events where we're talking to students about we talk to them about the affordability issues and the problems with textbooks, but then we also want them to know that open educational resources are a potential solution as well. That's right, yeah. So for instance, we've done a couple of events with students where we've got them to talk about, fill out a card as how they think an open educational resource would have benefited them. We have actually a postcard campaign. We're doing a similar thing as I guess you are here with the postcards. Only ours, we're actually putting labels with the dean of the college's address on them and getting students to write, what message would you like to give to your college about how open educational resources could make learning materials more accessible to you. So yeah, it's been well received by students.
I guess my question is, how did the instructors react? Were a lot of them open to having these resources available for students?
I have to say it's a challenge to engage faculty to be honest, around these questions. And I think that's why, we were sort of trying to run events and get people to come and listen to it. And I think that's why, in the end, Ali Versluis, our OER librarian, decided to just go and have individual one-on-one conversations with people to get the conversation going. I think that the faculty who are the most receptive are ones who are in the middle of a course redesign, which, that we have a course redesign institute at Guelph, and certainly we had conversations with faculty about that there. I would also say that there are many instructors who are already kind of doing this, in the sense that they don't have a commercial textbook for their course. They provide some kind of alternative, either their own materials that they've pulled together, or they create collections of content that is either openly licensed or available through the library for students to use instead of purchasing a textbook. So those faculty were really open to the idea. I think that a lot of faculty are hung up on, I would say the two biggest things are the labor involved in adapting, well, certainly creating one from scratch, but also the labor involved even in adopting an open textbook that already exists and then adapting it for your course. I don't think we realized the amount of labor that was involved until we worked on the microbiology textbook, because there were figures and images in that textbook that we had to, in the original textbook that the instructor wanted to use, and we essentially had to create brand new ones. So fortunately, we have a digital media lab in the library, and one of the first things they did, they had just got set up. They were tremendous in providing support for helping to create new versions of figures and images for the textbook. But not everybody has those kind of resources at their disposal. So I think the big question is around that. And the other big question is around the ancillary resources. Of course, commercial textbooks come with test banks and a lot of other additional materials, quizzes and things. Not all open educational resources have those, and if you're creating your own resource, obviously you're going to have to spend time creating those ancillary resources as well. So I think that is also a hurdle for some people too. So I would say time and resources is a big thing, and that one of the things that our group wants to work on over the next little while is finding ways, like for instance for the instructor who did the open textbook last year, we actually helped to fund a course buyout for her, but that's not going to be possible in every case. And obviously, I'm not sure how scalable that is. So these are issues that I think we'll be grappling with.
I just wanted to ask, I saw that some students opted to not purchase the textbooks, for instance. Did anyone talk about that as being a case of them maybe sharing an electronic copy of the textbook with other students? Because in my experience, that's mostly what's been happening.
Yes,
Yeah.
There was lots of data in the survey that I didn't actually include here. But one of the things we asked them is, what are you doing instead? And we heard everything from, well, I just find a pirated copy online and download it, or one of us buys a copy and then I make copies to share with my friends. In some cases, they just share a copy and, one person has it one night and one person the next. But there was actually lots of unhappiness around the copies that we're finding on the internet and downloading as well. Some of them had computer viruses with them. Some of them weren't around forever or were not particularly good quality. And there was also, I think, students were uncomfortable, many of them, with doing that. They just felt like they didn't really have any choice.
And how do the instructors, I guess, feel about that kind of sharing of?
Well, I don't even know how many of them know, to be honest. I think that, I really wish that every instructor on our campus had read this student textbook survey report. I'm guessing probably, a lot of them haven't. But I think that certainly some instructors we've talked to about that have really felt, I think it has made them rethink whether or not a commercial textbook is the way to go, just because we don't want to be driving students to, having to use pirated copies or as copyright officer. It's not something I want to see happen at the university anyway.
Okay, thanks so much, Heather. That's all the time we have for questions, so
Thank you.
thanks again for making the trip down here. You got some snacks. Next up, we're going to hear from Wendy Freeman and Laurie Harrison. Wendy Freeman is the director of the Office of eLearning at Ryerson University, and Laurie Harrison is the director of the Online Learning Strategies Initiative here at U of T. So welcome, Wendy and Laurie.
Thanks, Graham, and thanks for organizing us today as well. It's great to be here, and it's great to be working with Wendy again. We've worked together a few times before, and so this is a great chance to share a bit of a perspective. Now, we had some conversation right at the end about trying to think, how did instructors perceive this and what were their views and so on. So we fortunately have a study that we can share with you, an evaluation that we did, where we were engaging with instructors and their co-authors around the creation and adaptation of OER. And so what we would like to do today is share back with you some of our findings through that process. And I should also actually give a shout out to Hedia, who's here as well. Hedia also helped us with this evaluation program. So the things that we'd like to talk about is the outcomes of this study. It involved instructors from both of our universities. And in particular, we're going to talk a bit about the support perspectives and practical approaches. So it's a little bit nuts and bolts as we work down through it. And we're also interested in open pedagogy as well, and open practice and how we can support that. So I'm going to give a bit of an introduction of who were these instructors, what was going on, and then after I give a bit of a descriptive piece, then Wendy's going to dig in a little deeper on what we found. So one of the big questions that faces us to start with is what is an OER? Who here has ever had to face that question? What's an open educational resource? Or what's an open textbook, and what's the difference? So one of our challenges in setting up this evaluation was even trying to determine what we were working with, because sometimes it seemed like apples and oranges. Some people had an open e-text that was a text, and some people had something that had much more with ancillary resources and other things going on. So what we're showing you here is as a visual of the continuum that we observed in the different projects that we were working with in this study. And you can see that they range from, on the one side, adaptation, which is much easier to do. So on this side, on my right, your left, the easier end of the continuum, you're adapting something. Next to that, writing an original text is a little harder. Okay, now I'm adding some images to it. Oh, look, I could put some videos in there. It's getting harder. And oh, goodness, I want to put some animations and interactive items in there. So you can see. And then these little lines below on the second arrow, they actually represent where our projects fell along this continuum. So you can see we have this spattering along there. They had a range right from a simple text up to something that was much richer and had integrated media. So we're looking at feedback from projects that were all the way along this continuum, and we're going to try and throw a little light on the changes along the continuum, or the challenges along that continuum. So who were we working with? First of all, we had 5 open textbook projects at U of T, and we had 4 at Ryerson, and these were all through the eCampus initiative last year. So it gave us a chance to really get in up to our elbows in helping and supporting some of these projects. The topics ranged neuroscience, animal biology, political science, philosophy of science, nursing, design, adaptations, business. You can see there's a range there. And we also had authors and co-authors involved. Altogether, we had 17 respondees, so these are representing 17 responses. And we asked them some questions about their previous experience. So the respondents were some of them were sole authors, 7 of them, and 10 of them had been co-authors on a project. So we see also one of the interesting byproducts is an opportunity for collaboration, which leads to open pedagogy. So there's kind of a roll forward on the benefits there. We also asked them about their teaching experience. And here you can see there was a range. We had some people working on these projects that had no teaching experience, quite a few in what I'd call mid-career, mid-range, 10 years, 14 to 16 years, and then 20 years So the mid-career faculty were ones who were particularly interested in this activity. And then we also asked them about, did they have any previous experience? And we had a range from someone who'd actually coached, been involved in leading a workshop on developing OER, or had attended or helped with those sessions, previous training, had authored other types of OER, had developed online modules, or had just authored text in general. So you can see that most of them had none. We had a few who had had some training, and we had some that had previous experience. We also asked them about whether they had had any previous experience in using open textbooks in their courses, and we only had 2 of the group that had had previous experience. So many of these people were starting from a fresh perspective, having had no experience in even using open textbooks in their courses. And then we start to dig in a little deeper, and we started asking them questions why. So we're getting into a little bit of the what are their perspectives and the reasons why they might be involved in this. And if you take a look at the data we're presenting here, you can see that a lot of them actually were concerned with reducing costs. So just as it came through from the student perspective, a lot of instructors were genuinely concerned about that, so we had a high response there. There was also concern about getting good content, relevant content, customized content. Thirdly, sometimes just the variety of resources. They wanted to combine and adapt and create their own unique set of resources. And then finally, just ease of modification, adaptation, updating, and changing. So they didn't want a fixed resource. They wanted something that was dynamic and changing as they went along. We also had some open questions where we were asking them for their comments on the reasons why. And we're just sharing a few of those responses with you here today. On the one hand, they were interested in when there was a resource-constrained setting, which could be, I mean, it's a little bit of a philosophy. If you are someone who's a believer in open textbooks and you're concerned with having a philosophy of access, you may be concerned also about learners who aren't in the university, who may be in other international locations or in the field who don't have access to library resources. So that's international students, international graduate students. Also, whether or not the instructors have appropriate support. If they aren't getting exactly the resources that they need, it may be an option for them. Creating flexible opportunities for content. Sometimes we had comments that American content was a problem. Who did win the War of 1812? No one knows. Or new topics. Work integrated learning, for example, is a new topic, or that we want to integrate something from the workplace or new skills that we want to integrate. We need flexibility around that. Interactive resources, so active learning is on everyone's mind, so it's an opportunity to bring in more interactive resources, which is often linked to designing for a flipped classroom or blended classroom context. And then finally, some of the instructors just wanted to become more familiar with the authoring process. So those are a few of the characteristics and a little bit of an insight into what they were thinking about when they commenced on the project. And now I'm going to turn it over to Wendy, and she's going to tell us a bit more about what happened.
All right. I'm going to do something. I don't know. Does this one work? I'll just. Thanks. Thanks. And thank you for having me. Okay, this is not working. It is? Okay. Thanks for having me here at University of Toronto down the road. So one of the things that we were particularly interested in learning more about was what kind of support our authors needed for producing OER development. And we divided that into these 3 areas. At first in the survey, we actually gave them just a big, long laundry list of things that we thought we might have provided and things that might have been missing, and have organized this into these 3 different areas. So training supports, process supports, things like instructional design services, project management, budgeting, and technical and production services and supports. And as you can see, within each of these 3 categories, there are a number of different kinds of supports that were provided. And as you'll see further along, that it really, the amount that they use these supports really depends on the nature of the project that they were working on. So overall, in terms of the use of the supports, we asked them how much of these supports they used. And you can see that by and large, everybody who responded to the survey used some aspect pretty much of all of these supports. Training in particular was important for our authors. Process supports like instructional design and project management were important, and technical and production supports also important, but possibly not quite as much. But overall, there was a high demand for support in the authoring and production process. So in terms of the training supports, definitely this was new, as Laurie showed. This was a new process for most of the authors that we had that responded to our survey. So in terms of training, all of the books that were authored at Ryerson were press books. Was that? Yeah. Yeah, were press books. So they needed support in terms of how to use the technology, copyright information. We discovered that the concept of open and Creative Commons licensing was something that needed to be understood and learned by our authors. We provided some training courses and workshops, and also other open textbooks as a reference. So some of the authors that proposed these projects were doing so out of a real passion for creating new products, new content for their students, for their teaching, and weren't really attracted initially by the concept that it was actually an open textbook. They were really much more interested in creating great resources for their students. So they needed some training in the area of open textbooks and what an open textbook looks like, for example. So as you can see, all of these aspects of training were needed. In terms of process support, we put fairly high emphasis upfront on instructional design, helping faculty to structure their projects for learning, project management to help them move along. Information on budgeting was, in some of these projects, pretty important, although, as you can see, not quite as important as instructional design. Library support, particularly in the area of copyright, was very much needed, and peer review and evaluation was something that became important towards the end of the projects. When we see these, I'll just finish the next one, and then I'll just make a comment about the kinds of support that our authors needed. So I'm not going to go through all of these, but what I will say is that the thing about that we discovered about the technical and production support is that when it's needed 100%. So there's no sort of middle ground about technical and production support. So in terms of the high ones, press books, accessibility audit, copy editing, and book formatting, pretty much everybody took advantage of those kinds of supports. However, something like animation, there was only one real project that had a lot of animation. That was a project at Ryerson. So the amount used is low. That's the middle one. The amount used was low because it was only a couple of authors, but those authors used a lot of it. So this information is, there are some things that you can kind of rely on needing. Support of the platform, accessibility, copy editing, and book formatting, typically things that are typically associated with textbooks. But there are other elements that are used depending on the type of project. And I would say that is the case for all of these kinds of supports. So we also asked some open-ended questions from our authors about what they would recommend in terms of the kind of support that they valued. They definitely appreciated the workshops, particularly if they were new. But there was a lot of value placed on seeing examples and being helped through the initial process of authoring, for example, a first chapter as a prototype for the rest of the chapters, of being given some style guides, particularly in projects where there were multiple authors, having some style guides and examples that were useful. But a lot of what we discovered that they valued was really support in terms of managing the project. Oh, there's a mistake in there. Sorry. Oops. So lots of support in terms of project planning, facilitating regular team meetings, and then some things that were particular to the eCampus Ontario funding model that allowed for essentially 18 months to produce the textbooks. We discovered along the way that the timeline didn't really allow you. We know this from our students as well. You can write a draft, but that's not where you stop. So the timelines weren't necessarily long enough for content updates, and the timeline, there was no sort of flexibility. Things had to be done when the project budgeting cycle was done. As well, one of the things that I think we learned was that although there was a lot of emphasis placed on creating content, there was still a need to add supplemental copyrighted material in certain places, when particularly, for example, for certain images that were needed. So I'll turn it back to Laurie.
I'm just going to step in for a moment and share a couple of concrete examples. One of them is this magical looking flowchart here, which when we commenced some of these projects, was the situation that was facing us was we basically didn't know where to begin because we hadn't had experience in coaching a team through the process before. And you know, Wendy's talking about 18 months. Actually, I think Sanja's going 18 months. I think you had like 6 months or something like that to finish up. In some cases, even tighter timelines. Our main takeaway as we tried to work out a workflow was our discovery was that in using Pressbooks, that Pressbooks itself, while being a great publishing platform, does not lend itself to collaborative authoring. So we ended up with kind of a two-channel process where on the one hand, the actual collaborative authoring probably occurred in a different environment, whether it was Google Docs or Word Docs with tracking or whatever the various methods were. And then you would move over into Pressbooks and start with the publication piece, but then you do back in the collaboration channel. So there was this movement back and forth between them, but they were definitely two different areas of work activity. So that was something that we learned in the process. And then also, which when Wendy mentioned, the importance of prototyping a chapter very early. That's just such a important point that needs to be foregrounded. We can't emphasize that enough. So if anybody wants to see the magic of the full flowchart in all its glory, we actually also, as a part of our work with eCampus Ontario, had the opportunity to create a toolkit, an eText toolkit, and this is included in that, and I'll provide a URL and a link out to a whole set of resources around this at the end of the presentation. The other piece Wendy mentioned about the importance of project management, and I think this is just emphasizing, we certainly worked with instructors around trying to develop milestones and parsing out who's doing what and in what order and so on, iterating on the design. But one thing that we found was most often a bit of an aha moment was that there's actually instructional design involved in preparing these types of resources and thinking through in the same way that you would design a course that has outcomes and what's the scaffolding, what are the activities and so on. Those are equally possible in the context of an e-text development as well. So those are our two little tips, gems, and our learning from the process we wanted to share.
I think the other thing that I really learned from this process was, in particular at Ryerson, there was one textbook adaptation where a lot of students were involved in producing video and doing artwork, in actually writing some of the content. And so this is something that would never happen. These kinds of opportunities would never be made available to students in a traditional publishing setting. And to me, this was my aha moment around OER development, was the important role for engaging students in the creation of knowledge and in the creation of these resources. And so students were involved in all of our projects, more or less, as authors, as learners, as who could contribute, as research assistants, as production assistants, and to provide feedback and improvement. So in subsequent projects, I would always build in a lot of opportunities for students. Our authors also benefited a lot from having participated in these projects. There was definitely a shift from not knowing anything about open to valuing open, to learning how the creation of an open textbook could then inform how they were approaching their teaching in the classroom. And also expanding their professional network, being able to be given the opportunity to actually go out and start talking about what they had learned and being able to contribute in that area. And so everybody learned a lot, and we are now at Ryerson in the process of, the library has launched an initiative for further textbook adaptations, open textbook adaptations. So these are some of the sort of quotes from our faculty. Oops. Sorry. I think I don't know what time we're at.
I'll just give one more slide and I'll just
go
show
there.
that.
Yeah.
Yes, we aspire to have an incentive program here at the library. We have some plans afoot, so we're looking at ways that we could do something similar at U of T. Stay tuned. And I wanted to share this as well. This is where you will find our open textbook toolkit, and there are several people in this room who contributed to that. It was a collaborative effort between scholarly library, technical folks, instructional designers, and so on. So it's a slightly different angle. It's not just about copyright. It's not just about how to use Pressbooks. It's more written from an instructor or a developer perspective. And it's written in an FAQ format. We aim to be plain language. So if you are looking for a resource that's openly available, and it's also open access, CC BY, you can take it and reuse it in your own context. So we'll stop there. And do we have time for a couple questions maybe, Graham? If there are any.
I have a question about the university involvement from Ryerson, from senior administrators. What's their perspective about the development or future development of OER?
Yeah, certainly there's quite a bit of support in the senior administration for continuing to put an emphasis on developing open textbooks. In these times of budget cuts, I'm not sure what that will mean. Our student union actually used the textbook broke survey and haven't seen the results, but there's definitely an interest from the student union in terms of facilitating that, and I have attended some meetings with the student union rep and the provost in that area, and we've had some conversations with the chief librarian, Carol Shepstone, about creating an open textbook policy at Ryerson, an OER policy, more than just open textbooks, but an OER policy. So there is continuing vision that open access content is an important element in terms of equity for our students.
I guess what I was trying to get at too is that there's no concrete sort of in print emphasis, let's say, for university administrators to encourage faculty and instructors to develop the non-traditional publishing method, I guess.
So we are trying to, there is support from the provost to create a policy or guide, like not a policy, but a guideline to support it. We have a lot of activity in our library in terms of support for Pressbooks and run regular workshops, but in terms of something in print saying thou shalt do this, no, there's nothing like that. I don't know that that's the right approach for open, but yeah, we're working towards, at the request of the provost, a set of guidelines encouraging the use of open access materials. Yeah.
we have time for one more question, if there is one.
Have any of the instructors who participated in this study, have they started to or have an appetite to check in either with students or check for learning outcomes to see if there's, are they seeing any differences, in the outcomes of their courses once they've adopted these resources that they're developing?
That's a really great question. I'll just say briefly, and then I'll turn it over to you, Laurie. So in two cases, in one case, the instructor has been working with other faculty members who are adapting the textbook, and as well as doing a student survey. In the other, there's anecdotal support, and this instructor is planning to do a survey with students. Particularly in one case, they definitely feel that there's much improved outcomes in terms of using the material, but it's anecdotal at this point.
And I don't have any specific examples, but I would say that it's difficult to parse out the open resource as being the factor, right? You know this, you're in the SOTL business, but it certainly engages faculty in thinking about course redesign, and often the whole course becomes restructured as a result. Other things happen, and so I think it overall increases interest in thinking more critically about pedagogy and evaluating the impacts of decisions that are made either in the curation of the resources or in the design of the course overall. So I think it's just part of the broader fabric of supporting scholarship of teaching and learning among our faculty. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you so much.
All right, everyone, thanks for still being here. So our next session is called Instructor Adopter Perspectives on eCampusOntario-funded Adaptation Experience. And Sanja Hinic-Frlog, who's an assistant professor at the University of Toronto, Mississauga, Jessica Hanley, who's a science liaison librarian at UTM, and Nguyen, who helped support this project as well, affiliated with eCampus Ontario, will be speaking with us. Thank you.
Thank you. So a lot of what we're going to talk about are some of the themes that were already mentioned. So I guess we don't have a lot of data. We're just a little case study of the things we went through last year at this time. And from my perspective, I'll let you know what my personal motivation was for this project. And I have a confession. It wasn't cost related. And the reason is that I mostly worked really hard with the publisher to tailor the content of the textbook I was using already to reduce the cost for the textbook to $90, which is for a science course, a large science course in anatomy and physiology, not so bad. So my issue was that a lot of the content that I was teaching didn't really quite match with the textbooks I was trying to tailor to the course. So I was focused on learning experience of students in my courses, or in this particular animal physiology course. And one of the reasons I've noticed this is happening that, for example, when I was a student, a lot of the content that I'm now teaching in second year was introduced in first year. So the end result is that the textbooks didn't quite change to how we're teaching in different departments of biology, so that essentially I was having to struggle pulling content from either first year, very broad content, and second year or third year courses, textbooks aimed at third year courses that were very specialized. And I was somewhere in the introductory and a little bit more advanced for some topics level. I saw an invitation or advertisement or call for eCampus funding that Laurie sent out. And another confession is that I saw the email and I ignored it for a long time because I was like, can I do this? Can I do this? Can I do this? Do I want to do this? And I finally emailed her, and I think she actually encouraged me because I was very like, I don't know if I can do this, I don't have time. So through the process of communicating with her and through the learning a little bit more about how this funding will go through, I've learned quite a lot about the kinds of supports I would have in the process, which encouraged me to stick with it. Along the way in the application for the funds, I've also learned that this is not something that was, this textbook, open textbook, didn't quite exist at that time for the introductory animal physiology. There was no Canadian version of the textbook. So all of these, there's more and more signals that told me that it's probably the time to address this. Most importantly, in the end, is that I had control. My course is very based on active learning. It's a large course, 480 students. I've already had learning outcomes that were designed that match to the active learning activities I do in the class, content we cover in the class, labs and tutorials we run. So this allowed me to tailor the content to the learning outcomes that I was trying to achieve or get students to achieve in the course. In the end, the cost reduction is still quite significant because it's $90 that students no longer have to pay for 480 students every year. So just a little over $40,000 every year. Okay, so our goals is, I already mentioned I'm not going to do this animation, I'm just going to do it this way, is to adapt already established content, which also made it much more manageable to develop. I didn't have to write from scratch. I had to write certain pieces that would connect the content or certain pieces that would connect to the learning outcomes of the textbook and of the course. We integrated resources in the way that we're hoping other instructors can use it and adapt the courses to their needs, just like CC BY, a model. We also, we think we created a model that engages the learners. So currently students are also part of developing and continuing to develop this textbook. Through this, already, I think we shared quite a bit in terms of, or other people have shared about us what we're doing, which is really exciting because now I have other instructors actually coming to talk to me and asking me questions about what was this experience like, how did you start this, where did this come from, how do I do it, and so on. Because a lot of instructors are already actually doing pieces of this, but maybe need more support to actually completely do an open textbook. The most exciting part about this, as was mentioned in previous presentations, was that I am just one face of this project. It was a completely collaborative project. We did have from September to March, and this collaboration meant, or this short time span meant a couple collaboration was the key. So we had involved right from the start of the project 3 students at UTM. One of them will tell you things from her perspective, who help us, and one of them is here as well, Arlene. Yeah, 2/3 of our team is here. They will tell you, they actually got involved in terms of developing content-specific figures and activities icons that we included in the textbook that showed students what kind of activities or how this connects with the textbook or the content of the course. We also had librarians involved, so this is one half of our librarian team. And of course we had Laurie, I just pointed at Will and Laurie, who helped us actually quite a bit in terms of project management. And to me, that was the most challenging part because I've never gone through a project this size. So Will was actually really integral in making sure that we actually complete a lot of the steps that we were completing or planning to complete in such a short time frame. One of the things that is happening right now, so book was kind of tested in the summer in a 50-person or maybe 70-person course, summer version of the course, but we fully integrated it now in this winter course. We have developed sources through collaborations with students that are specific to our textbook. So just like you've heard in other presentations, so figures that we specifically need for the course. Excuse me. Along the way, I also have, this is for me now a way to showcase work for my students in the past, who of course agree or want to share this kind of content. So for example, it's a way to showcase our campus. UTM campus is there's a nature trail, and we can actually walk outside, take photos of deer, take photos of birds, and I can integrate some of this content that students actually collect into the textbook. In September, I believe in September or sometime in the summer when we were done with the first version. So this textbook is still very much, I kind of think of it as a first draft version. I've emailed people in biomedical communications, which is a department we have at University of Toronto, Mississauga. And I thought it was very uncomfortable because it felt like self-promotion a little bit, but I talked to them about, hey, we developed this textbook. Do you have any students who are interested in working with us on this? Because at that point, our funding has expired. We developed the first draft, but there's still more to do. And now, just this past fall, the end result is that we have a collaboration where students in, the course is called Visual Representation of Medical Knowledge. So 18 students in this class, this was their project, developing a figure for their class. And this is a first-year graduate student class in biomedical communication. Currently, students are sending me emails and saying, this makes no sense. This figure is missing. So there's certain things that are really exciting to me, even though it seems a little bit scary that students are sometimes, or you're not presenting something perfect to students, but at the same time, this is an opportunity for students to develop critical reading and critical thinking skills that go beyond the content of the course, and I think are the key for their education and university. So Jessica will tell you a little bit about the library side of things.
Yeah, so I'm just going to talk for maybe about 2 minutes about the library collaboration in this project. So it was myself and Simone Lawton, who couldn't be here today, but she's the head of our library instructional technologies. So I am the liaison librarian for most of the sciences at UTM, I think 8 of them. So Sanja had come to me about looking for content for this, and I was kind of a good fit. I was a molecular biologist in a past life, so I understood the content as well as the research needed. So my role in the project was to kind of research some OER or OA resources we could use in the textbook. I verify the copyright. If anything needed permissions, I'd contact the person to get the permissions when needed. So that was my main involvement. Simone was a really good technical support. She's very familiar with Pressbooks. She did all the AODA requirements. And her and I worked together to edit the final copy, or I guess our first draft copy with Sanja. And then we also are going to continue to collaborate and update this book together as a team. We're currently going through ethics to kind of put a request together to collect more student data and usage information to help us going forward. And then we also worked very closely with Will and Laurie to help us really, it was most of us, I think, the first time using Pressbooks, so they were really fundamental help in any questions we had and how to set up the template and so on. So it was kind of the library involvement with the project.
And then Kim will tell us a little bit about the student side of things.
Yes, so I was one of the designers on the project along with Arlene. We mainly designed action icons for the students, so whenever they would go through a textbook, you'd see an icon and it'd be like, oh, you need to read more, there's more resources available on this information, so then you can further understand the concepts illustrated in the textbook that you might not otherwise already understand. And also Abby was the one that helped develop the textbook in Pressbooks. We mainly use Adobe software, and I think a big learning part of this project was researching the AODA and web accessibility guidelines, because prior to this project, I didn't really know anything about that. And being someone that is able, I don't really see how, someone that may have a disability uses a textbook differently than someone who does not have a disability. So I think being the designer and having to think about those guidelines puts me in like the closest position to understand that more. So I think I also developed more of a passion towards accessibility design through this project. So our iconography aimed to direct readers and to engage them more in the content. So like I said before, like taking actions, doing more than just reading, but maybe they have to write an essay or, read other content that will help them understand things better. We also did diagrams and graphics to illustrate concepts that were hard to understand without a visualization. So that was kind of challenging as well because we didn't have a lot of other resources to look at as a basis. So it's kind of having to learn some of the scientific concepts, which isn't one of my strong points personally, and then having to visualize that and create that. I was able to attend today on the condition that I talked about my role at eCampus. So I work as a multimedia and web designer there. Prior to working there, actually, I was just a student that happened to work on this project, and then I realized that the project was funded by eCampus, and then I worked at eCampus, so I was just like, this is really meta, but yeah, that just happened. So my role is to create various print and web media. I also do a lot of the procurement, so like the hat that I'm wearing, or like the pin, and like I'm wearing socks too. I have to do all the merchandising, also like all the stuff that you guys see on the tables. We have a lot of initiatives you guys might have heard of, such as the SXD Lab, Open Library, and the Learn Online portal. So I'm helping to help other staff members at our institution and supporting them in reaching their goals with their associated initiatives.
Okay, so just to wrap things up, I think maybe there's another, oh yeah, future as well. There's future. What we learned so far, so for all of us, as you can see, a lot of this was new. So there was learning moments all along the project in every single meeting, because we either use new tools we haven't used before, new software, new platforms. We also learned a lot about how fast we can accomplish things when we're working together, and sometimes where things crumble, what is missing in the project management side of things. And so we learned something about ourselves. But we can also, was particularly neat for me is also how quickly these new collaborations can actually work together, because I didn't know Kim much, or Jessica, or Arlene, or any of the team members until we actually just stepped into this brand new project space together. And it's actually really exciting how I'm sure this is only just a start. There's so much more to do, and it seems like more people are, or every time you talk about this kind of project, there's people who are passionate about it will just pop up and be in your face, which is amazing. One thing that I really like about this is that it's really a living, evolving document. And the evolving part students are involved with, and for me that was really one of the hidden goals, I think, that I didn't really completely appreciate until I saw how much students are caring about this project and about the textbook. And just so you know, I don't have data yet, but anecdotally, students are, some of the comments I heard are mostly positive. The one that kind of sticks with me is that a few students have told me that they never had a textbook that matches the content and what they do in class as much, which is really something that that was one of my goals. I wanted them to not be lost between the class and the textbook. So where we would like to go is a lot of the themes that were already brought up. So things that I would like to see is more of a tracking of learning outcomes. So when students do certain activities or interactions which are still in development, that we for now can just link into the textbook. We would like to be able to somehow develop a tracking of learning outcomes through the textbook, similar to some of the resources that come with publisher textbooks. Also full integration into Quirkus. Right now it's more of a link and PDF files that I provide for students. In terms of eCampus Ontario, there's further development in how this textbook will be shared widely. So this is something that's developing on their side. And in terms of community, I'm just excited to see where this project can go and what kind of further collaborations it will bring. And I'm also excited about the kinds of questions I've been getting from people in my department and beyond. I, for example, got a phone call from a person in economics when they heard about this project saying, I've been doing this for years. How do I make this happen in the Pressbook type of platform? So there's interest and a lot of people are already doing this, and this collaboration or established collaboration through eCampus funding and through technical support just allows us to share this more widely, which is great. And that is it, I think. Is there anything happening? No, end of slide. Thank you.
So we have a couple of minutes for one or two questions. If anyone has one, raise their hand.
Thank you so much for this presentation. I found it fascinating when you described that students can actually contact you and tell you which part of the textbook is not clear or something is missing. How do you collect this feedback? Is it just by email? Would you say that something that is integrated into the textbook to collect feedback would work?
I'm not as organized. Maybe you can tell from how quickly I talk. But basically, it's I ask students to email me, and that could actually be a barrier. So it's probably a way to. The idea is to integrate some kind of comment section in the textbook that we can work on. But for now, I just ask students to email me, and some of them have been okay with it. But probably through survey, more of these comments will come out as well, because it's anonymous.
I'm just curious, from the moment that you decided to pursue this project, that click to accept that email to ask for help, to now where you are at now, how long has it been?
I'm kind of blown away with how this happened, and I think it's thanks to everybody around me, because I thought of it as like, okay, I always wanted this, and I'm going into something I don't know much about. Like, I'm really focused on learning experiences of students, right. But I think I'm really proud, to be honest, that something that, like how far this has gotten in such a short time span. Because usually I don't have that in my life. Things take forever, but this is just like, you have no choice. It's just happening really quickly, and it happens relatively smoothly.
So it's been what, a year? 3 months?
We started officially last September. We finished, the budget was end of March. September to March, so that's 6 months of development, and then a year, like now, the textbook was ready for use for students.
Wow, that's great. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Sanja, Kim, and Jessica. Yeah, I know. So next up we have Ingrid. I apologize if I mispronounce your last name. Barany.
Yep, no, that was great.
And Maksym Shcherbina.
You got that right.
And Ingrid and Max are both fourth-year undergraduate students who will be sharing their experiences working on an eCampus Ontario-funded adaptation of a neuroscience textbook. Take it away.
Thanks. Thanks for having us. We're just going to talk a little bit about student collaboration and how that worked with our adaptation of a textbook. And I guess as we said, this is Ingrid.
Yeah, so I'm a fourth-year undergraduate student here at U of T, and I'm doing a major in health and disease, immunology, and art history.
Yeah. And I'm Max Shcherbina. I'm a fourth-year undergraduate as well, and my background is in human biology and cells and systems biology. And so we were approached by Dr. Bill Ju in one of my neuroscience courses, and we really were passionate about getting on board with this because, first of all, we kind of both wanted to experience science communication from like a first-hand perspective to see what that is like, and also it was kind of an opportunity for us to shape exactly what education for future classes in this course would look like, because sometimes I'm sitting in a classroom and I'm thinking, well, like I would have probably maybe approached this differently a little bit, or I would have explained this in a bit of a different way to appeal to me more than else. Yeah. I don't know if you know.
Yeah, so I really wanted to tackle challenges like providing simpler and clearer diagrams. Like Max said, as a student, I'm sitting in class sometimes, and a lot of my professors are like, well, I like this kind of diagram because it has these points here, but I don't like certain points from it. So I really wanted to be part of it and kind of contribute to making education a lot more accessible and clear for students like myself. And the idea of like novel narratives and to explain complex scientific concepts was one of the challenges that I wanted to get on board. Because it was something that I struggled with as a student, and having taken this course, I wanted to use my experience to make it a lot easier for future students.
Yeah. And it was also kind of daunting but exciting to be able to actually use that material and not apply it in a test or some kind of essay, but actually to develop something for the course and realize that, yes, I do have this knowledge and I can concretely prove that by making figures or by making different concepts. Yeah. So this was our contribution. This was the textbook, Neuroscience, the Canadian first edition, open textbook. And so what we did was we created figures based on the textbook material that Dr. Bill Ju had written, as well as other open, or I guess it would just be figures from the lecture slides that he would provide us. And we sometimes would need to reinterpret those figures completely, as well as sometimes just editing them, because Dr. Ju would say, for instance, part B of this figure is not really pertinent to what we're studying, but part A is very pertinent, so don't pay attention to that. So we would have to maybe readjust the figures that way. And if you want to talk a little bit more about it.
Yeah, for sure. And a big part of it was so adding alternative text to figures, but also the idea of making it a little bit more clear and having a unified design. That was one of the challenges that we'll talk about a little bit later, but the idea of using the same color schemes all throughout the textbook so that you get a theme going. And as a student, by the second time you see a diagram with these color schemes, you already know what they represent, and it's a lot easier to understand and it's a lot clearer.
So we kind of, when me and Ingrid started working together, we sat down and we sort of developed our textbook of our own, sort of, to say, okay, for this chapter where they're learning about optogenetics, for instance, here, we will always be using this type of yellow color to relate inhibition of a signal, and this blue color will always be like excitation. And we will always be using this type of font at this type of size for these figures, so that a student who is flipping through the entire chapter will have a through line and constantly be understanding what each slide is trying to relate to them. Because so often I feel figures are kind of added in from different sources, and those sources will use different colors or relate concepts in different ways, showing a protein, whether it's just a spherical ball or a very complex thing. And we felt that we wanted to kind of unify that. Yeah, and as well as people have mentioned before, making our images not open access, sorry, but accessible to people who may not be able to view them in the same way. We also had to contribute to that by writing alternate text and stuff like that. Yeah, so as I kind of mentioned before, to lay claim to my knowledge of the course by showing that I understand the concepts in something that's other than just my GPA or my marks, that was a really big plus to doing this.
Yeah, and it was just kind of a challenge to create new ways of thinking about diagrams based on student feedback. I know a lot of the times when I was coming up with the ideas and the storytelling, I would refer back to my notes and how I understood the concepts and how I collaborated with my team members when we were studying. So that way you kind of have a new way of thinking about like a very, very traditional idea. It's also one of the benefits, but also one of the challenges were to overcome these technical barriers, like navigating new softwares with Adobe Illustrator is what we use to make all the diagrams, but also Pressbooks and uploading our diagrams and making the captions and all of that. So that was definitely a challenge, but now I look at it more as a benefit because I got a lot better at using these technologies. And it goes back to this idea of pushing the boundaries and bridging the gap between art and science. So it goes back to better visual communication and understanding, especially from a student perspective. And by doing this, I think one of the biggest things that I learned was these cross-transferable skills. You know, it's not just about making a textbook and making these diagrams, but it's the skills that you learn from it and are able to use them in other settings as well. So I just wrote down things like storytelling. I think that was a big one to kind of, we'll show some sample diagrams at the end of the presentation that really shows that. But one of the challenges of being a science student is you're faced with a lot of memorization of different pathways. So that could be really challenging to remember down the road. So you remember for your test and then you forget about it. So this idea of storytelling, it kind of, you remember the main concepts a lot later as well. So it's easier to understand and it's easier to learn for your test. Also, collaboration was a huge one, and learning to critique and to work with your team and kind of say, okay, this wasn't as strong in the diagram, but maybe try to think of it like this. So it's critiquing your own work is kind of difficult because, you know, you think it's the best thing that you've ever done, but taking a step back and working with your peers to come up with like novel ways of thinking about it and pushing the boundaries and making it even better. And the idea of prioritizing is, especially in science, you're faced with so much information, and this is relevant to all the other fields as well, but it's prioritizing like the main concepts and thinking like you can't write all the information down at once. So that was another skill that we learned. And the idea of process. So you start off with, you know, you make sketches of what you think you want to show and you critique those sketches, and it's a process. You don't just come up with the finished product at the end in one day. Most of the time.
It was a lot of prototyping, and it's great that there's now like a workflow that people can actually follow, because I think for us it was a lot of touch and go and figuring it out as we went. And
yeah, for sure. And you know, showing Dr. Drew, who was our instructor, and asking him like his opinion, but oftentimes like everyone was so busy. So the idea of process was a huge one as well, and not really taking shortcuts, because then you see that at the end. If you took a shortcut, it's not, the finished product isn't as well done. So.
And just to speak on the figure on the bottom here, we were also taking our notes into account, obviously, and a lot of the time when we were learning these concepts in class, I found myself adding on little things to try to make myself understand that. And so when we were actually asked to, you know, work on this textbook, I kind of tried to incorporate some of that stuff. So for instance, DNA going from 5' to 3', but when this gene is inhibited or flipped in this process, you kind of actually show those numbers, the little 5' to 3' there, to show that it's going the other way. So just little things that to me were not there in the original figures, but when I recreated them, I actually made a point to add them, because it just helps understanding so much. And like Ingrid was saying, storytelling wise, you're able to maybe start off with a much more general example and trying to and go very what I'm trying to say, like very on point, I guess, or just very critically or very narrowly, let's say. And yeah, so that was just part of that process for us. So yeah, we can talk about challenges. People are saying that very short amounts of time were sometimes given, especially when you're making these figures. It does take a lot of commitment. And I think we started around April, so during exam season, it was a little bit challenging for us. But we pulled through. And it was also very difficult, again, with the workflow, because Pressbooks didn't really allow multiple people to work on the same chapter at once. It was very difficult to try to build a chapter that way, but so we also used Google Docs and things like this to help with that. I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, so collaboration was one of the challenges as well, because like we mentioned, these diagrams, we wanted to show a continuity and a flow, but there were 3 different people working on these diagrams, and we all had different ways of showing something. So to be able to come together and have like a cohesive way of illustrating a concept and making it look like it was done by one person who made all these things was definitely a challenge, because we wanted to look organized and presentable like you would see in an actual like textbook, in a hard copy textbook. So we wanted to preserve that, and that was a little bit challenging.
And that meant sharing fonts between us and deciding on one specific way that we're going to present
And
everything.
one color scheme was like the hardest part.
Yep.
That was like, what color should we choose to show inhibition? Like that was.
Yeah, sharing a lot of color codes, those hex, it was a lot.
And then, the idea of working in a team environment, I mean, it gets stressful, but it's also very rewarding when you come together and you give a presentation on your work. I think that's very rewarding, but at the same time, it's definitely a challenge working in a team because you have to collaborate with a lot of different people and you have to take in their perspectives into account and, you know, come to a mutual conclusion when you can't decide what color you want, you know? So working in team environment, workload was a huge one as well. Like Max mentioned, this was during exam season that we decided to take this project on because we really wanted to be a part of it. So as students, we have so many other things going on, and this was part of it too. But we made time and we tried to stick to a schedule, even if that meant staying up late. But that's okay.
And that kind of comes back to team environment. Like if people were busy for a week, then we would pick up that kind of work, and we all divided it based on exactly how much time everyone kind of had.
Yeah, and that wasn't written on the side, but communication was like a huge one as well, because like Max said, sometimes, you know, like you would have so many things going on that you have to tell your partner, I have to study for an exam, like you will not hear from me. And then you kind of, you collaborate and you take on the workload that your partner couldn't do, but then they do the same thing next time. And this idea of balance between simplicity and hyper simplicity, that was more with the figures. And I think a huge challenge was making it simple and clear for your audience, but not really dumbing down. I hate that term, but not making it too simplistic that you're kind of omitting important details that you need to learn about this figure, but at the same time not making it overly complicated where your audience kind of no longer understands or is kind of overwhelmed by everything. So you have to, you know, break it down and making it easy for your audience. And that's the idea of the role of the audience. You really have to see who your audience is. So for us, it was very much the students in the course that were taking this. So it was, the textbook was directly related to the lectures, and that was directly related to how the students were being tested. So it was very much meant to allow the students to excel in an exam setting or a midterm setting. So that's the textbook was catered specifically for students. So that was definitely a challenge as well.
And so just thinking about the future and kind of even the now for some of these points, I think it would be amazing if each class had this own kind of experience where there is an open e-textbook where students can contribute to it, whether it's through figures or even through text. I was part of another class last semester, also taught by Dr. Ju, where the final project was essentially creating it was a health and disease course, so it was a group of students talking about one disease and writing basically a textbook chapter about that disease, incorporating modern papers that are currently being released. And so that was the final project, and you basically ended up with a textbook of 5 or 6 chapters chronicling these different diseases. And I think that's great because students can actually just point to that and say, this is something that I did it's published, and it's something that I can show that's more than just an essay or a paper that I did. And I think that's great. And yeah, it's also just amazing for us, I think, to be able to contribute to this and showcase the work. And I think more so than whatever mark I got on that final test, this is what I'm most proud of from that course that I actually took away from it. And in fact, it's also something that stands the test of time to some extent, because those textbooks that I got in first year or second year, I have long sold because I need the money. But but also, if I had access to a textbook online through Top Hat or other services, those are no longer available to me. Meanwhile, for this year's courses, I've actually gone back to this textbook and used material from that textbook in my presentations and in my work. So I think it's just great even for us to be able to go back to it and solidify our knowledge if we forgot something.
Yeah, and this kind of goes beyond just, textbook figures that we created, but it goes back to the idea of visual communication across different media. So not only 2D images, but also creating videos and websites. So for example, Max and I were working for another professor, Dr. Wilson at U of T, where we created a histology website for his third year course. And then we wanted to implement videos as well that kind of go hand in hand with this. So it's not just creating a textbook, but it's creating interactive media too. So that goes with visual communication, but also this goes way beyond my capacities, but it's in the future, it's to create interactive technologies for better understanding different, for example, in anatomy, understanding complex 3D concepts, you can create interactive things. Max and I were actually even looking through PowerPoint, and you can do 3D models of the heart. I mean, that's just one of them, but if you don't have access to go into a lab, into all these see a heart in front of you, you can kind of do like a virtual reality kind of thing. And I know that there's a lot of different people who are working on that, but that's just where the field is headed, and there's so much opportunity for interactive technologies to kind of enhance student learning. So.
Yeah. Sorry, thinking back. Yeah, and I think even in terms of incorporating it into a website is also possible in that way, because like you can just have plugins, or I think H5 is a software where you can add like multiple choice quizzes that can then connect with Quirkus and other systems like that. So just to enhance learning beyond what a textbook could allow, I think is amazing.
And allowing for student input as well in terms of like the comments section.
Yeah.
In case you don't want to email your instructor, you can kind of do it anonymously and get feedback. I mean, that's what we've received from the website as well. We've implemented that.
Yeah. And the numbers also, we don't have also data, we kind of have anecdotal evidence as well, but also just in terms of website hits before midterms or before exams, those definitely spike up quite a lot. If in a class of like 300 students, it goes up to the thousands because people are just clicking and trying to remember everything. So yeah, so just some examples of our figures as well. If you guys have any questions, please come forward.
Thank you so much. That was an amazing presentation.
Thank you.
If there are any questions, let me know and I'll come running to you.
Sort of.
I actually had the pleasure of talking to Dr. Bilju, who is the instructor who is behind the project last week or so, and he was talking about the importance for students, particularly if they're moving on to graduate school, to have these skills around transferring knowledge through communication. I see Sanja's nodding as well, that it's an expected skill, and you talked about having a portfolio. And I'm just going to put Ingrid on the spot, because we were sitting here and she told me a little story about last week, so I'm going to ask Ingrid to share that story.
Yeah, so actually I saw that in one of your figures was created by a biomedical communications student. And that kind of made me chuckle a little bit and nudge Max, and I was like, read that caption, because that program is really this, but on a whole different level. It's about showcasing storytelling and illustrating scientific concepts. And I feel like these different skills can come in handy, especially if you're doing an interview for something like this, where you visual communication, but also communication. And for example, speaking at the TEST conference, which I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but that's the technology-enabled seminar and showcase that Max and I were part of, and we were sharing what we did for the work with Dr. Drew. So having communication skills like this, I think, really helps for graduate school as well.
I'm going to tell them. She had an interview last week, and she used this as her example, and so we wish her luck. We hope she does.
Oh, no.
Yeah, even I am going into more of a just grad school in terms of just scientific, like cells and systems biology, and even for me to be able to, like, this was such a great experience in terms of getting concepts and then trying to simplify them in like for poster presentations where the public are not completely science-based, if there's humanities people or whatever, then yeah, like the skills that I learned here in terms of simplifying figures and presenting them a little bit better, I've definitely used there as well. So as students, I think this was amazing for us. Yeah.
Any other questions, Kim?
I just want to say that from a design perspective, this is just very aesthetically pleasing to look at. So congratulations. And maybe you guys are like coming for my job or something, but this looks really nice.
Thank you.
I think, yeah, what you mentioned, like, yes, these figures are aesthetically pleasing to look at, but it goes beyond just that. It kind of captivates you, and it's the idea of storytelling. Your attention is captivated, you look at these figures, you understand them, and then you have this visual memory of what the figure looked like, and you have this flow from different ideas one to the other. And if you're in a midterm setting, you kind of think back, okay, what was that figure on page 6? Okay, let me see, okay, the virus, like you kind of remember that, and it helps you understand these concepts. So it is about, visual communication, and it makes you want to understand. It doesn't take it away, you're not overwhelmed. You might be a little bit, but you kind of motivated to dig deeper and understand. So that was part of the point. Thank you.
Well, if there aren't any other questions, I'd like to ask everyone to give another round of applause. And that's the day's presentations. Thanks everyone for coming, and I'd like to encourage you to fill out the feedback forms that we passed out and leave them behind on the desk. And if you prefer to fill them out electronically, we'll send out a link to the form to those of you who were registered for today's event, but those of you who aren't registered, you won't get the link, unfortunately, so please fill out the form if you're not. And just a final thank you to everyone who spoke. It was great to hear everyone's perspective, and thank you for coming, everybody. Thank you, Laurie.